In this session, we will be thoroughly discussing and exploring the practical application of quantile regression methods. As I frequently do, I will be utilizing the excellent resources available on Finance Research Gate website. So, what I like to do now is to select just one specific frequency value, and after that I'll need to adjust the time frame so that it begins precisely in the year 2000 and then continues all the way through to 2020, or perhaps even extending up to 2024. And then we are going to select our X variable. Our focus today will be to carefully analyze the profound impact that financial leverage has on a firm's investment intensity. Specifically, our primary independent variable, and indeed the sole focus of our current analysis, will be what we define as market leverage, which essentially represents the company's overall debt intensity. We will then meticulously examine how this particular factor influences the level of investment intensity. Once the step is completed, the website will then proceed to construct the actual working sample for our analysis. And for this particular part, I'm going to make sure that we actually lag the X variable by precisely one period. So after this, I'll just take a moment to briefly examine the descriptive statistics. This will be a necessary step before we move on to our main regression analysis. It's quite clear from the data that we currently have some significant outliers present. Consequently, we'll need to effectively deal with these unusual data points. Our chosen method for handling this particular issue will be Winsorization. Our plan is to Winsorize both the X variable and the Y variable. We'll apply a 1% level of Winsorization to each, which means we'll be capping the extreme values at the 1st and 99th percentiles. This process will then allow us to create these new Winsorized versions of the variables for our analysis. Following that, our next step will be to conduct an analysis of the quantile regression. Now, before I proceed with that, let's take a moment to examine the OLS regression. We'll do this specifically to compare and highlight the key differences between the standard OLS approach and the quantile regression method. For this analysis, we'll be using the Winsorized Y variable, specifically the version that does not include any writing. And for our independent variable, which we'll denote as X, we're going to carefully select the Winsorized lagged market leverage. Once that's done, we'll then proceed to execute our ordinary least squares regression analysis. We can clearly observe that this relationship is negative, indicating that with higher financial leverage, firms generally tend to invest less capital. However, this particular relationship may not hold consistently across the entire spectrum or distribution of investment levels. For example, what would be the precise relationship between a high investing firm and a low investing firm? So rather than just looking at the entire distribution of our Y variable, we have the option to break it down into several distinct parts. This fundamental concept is precisely what lies behind the use of quantiles. Now, as we move forward into more advanced regression techniques, let's specifically choose and focus on our Y variable. Of course, we are specifically referring to the Winsorized one, as expected. And the main, and indeed the sole regressor that we are considering is the market leverage. And if you look down in this area, we can easily select the quantile regression. So, for instance, if I were to select the number 25, what that signifies is that my research is focused on examining the influence of financial leverage, specifically on the 25th percentile within the overall distribution of investments. So, my primary focus is specifically on firms that exhibit a 25% investment ratio. This means I'm carefully selecting the lowest quartile or the bottom 25% of the entire distribution of the Y variable. The core question I'm investigating is precisely how this particular characteristic ultimately influences their overall investment patterns. Now, if I were to implement this specific methodology and then proceed to run the quantile OLS regression specifically targeting those firms that exhibit low investment activity, considering that my selection criteria here is indeed a low investment ratio, the observed impact or effect would then be considerably smaller in magnitude compared to what is typically reported by a standard OLS regression. But what if I were to substantially increase the amount of capital I'm putting in and specifically direct those funds towards companies that exhibit a much higher investment ratio? For instance, to give a concrete example, let's set that benchmark at 75%. In that case, we would have a completely different coefficient. We could even consider increasing that to a full 85%. And we can now clearly see that the coefficient actually became even more statistically significant and negative. Therefore, what we initially observed within the OLS model, that particular finding was specifically representative of the overall general distribution. However, if we specifically choose a low investing ratio and focus on firms with low investment, then the relationship we observe may even become positive. In this particular case, it's not statistically significant, but this outcome is notably different from the OLS results because the previously negative and significant correlation is no longer present. So, this is the fundamental concept that underpins the quantile regression model. Thank you for taking the time to watch.